Hello, this is Pat Lynch, and you are listening and watching As the World Turns or Burns. Joining me, as we do every podcast, Kieran O'Keefe, Brendan Connell, and then behind the board, the magic board, is...
Producer Cheyenne.
As always. So this is the season ending, As the World Turns or Burns, and we call it Christmas in May. All right, it's things that we hope that could happen in politics to just make things better, maybe less chaos. That might be a good place to start, but we all have kind of things, our own Christmas list. And Kieran, we're going to start with you. So kind of, what do you have as far as things that you'd like to change, things that could make things better?
So starting with the first one on the list I put together was ending partisan gerrymandering.
Yes.
And it's number one on my list because I think it's actually realistic. There are a lot of other structural changes you might want to try to make to the Constitution, to the government, which I think would be really, really difficult and almost impossible. Yeah. This is one that I think has some shot of eventually being passed. There was some discussion of it early in Biden's presidency, though it couldn't muster support to get past the filibuster in the Senate. And I mean, one of the biggest problems you have is the incentives, I think, are misaligned for politicians. Mm-hmm. So in the House, you have 435 members. The vast majority of those members represent districts that are very safe in a general election. So their biggest concern in most cases, not all, but most cases, is not losing a primary. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, it pushes politicians to more political extremes. If you want to encourage coalition building and moderation, you're better off having more competitive districts. So in Arkansas, we don't really have any competitive districts. Granted, Arkansas is so red that it's probably be hard to draw a truly competitive district.
But they did some like reconfiguring around Little Rock, right? That they kind of pushed all the Democrats into just one district, if I remember correctly.
I think they split a lot of them in the Little Rock area, the way it's drawn.
So then it diminishes the vote?
Yeah. So I think the district around Little Rock, the Cook Political Report gives it a Republican +9, I want to say, which is the most competitive in the state.
Right.
Which is still not very competitive. Like the one we're in is like +16 or something like that. Yeah. It's just not competitive at all. So yeah, if you have districts that are more competitive, they don't all need to be competitive, but if right now, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but the percentage that are competitive is very low. It's a very small minority. Right. The number of members of Congress who could realistically lose their seat in a general election is just not very high. Mm-hmm. And if you make them afraid of losing a general election, that's going to just encourage more compromise, which is hard but necessary in politics and in governance. And I think would encourage better behavior, probably less grandstanding. They're trying to look like a rational, effective politician. Maybe avoid some of the nonsense we see on social media and the way that politicians behave to appeal to the base.
Taylor Greene effect.
Yeah, I mean, she's in a district that she will never ever lose.
Right.
They could nominate like a turtle and it would win that district. Like it doesn't matter. Like Republicans always win that district.
Right.
And that's true for way too many districts, and for Democrats too, especially in urban areas where they have districts that are extremely blue, and their real threat is losing from the left, not from the center or the right.
How you may know this, that it seems the courts never seem to rule against gerrymandering. They consider it just politics, and not that there's any laws that are being broke. So how do you go, kind of reverse this? Because, there's software programs, algorithms that are just, have perfected how to, when whatever the majority party is, they go in and here's the way to diminish the impact and the potential, seats that will be won by the opposing party.
Yeah, there are different ways you go about it. I know in Canada, for example, they have independent commissions that are put together to draw what they call ridings, which are their congressional districts or their parliament districts. And they're composed of people who are not allowed to be in political office or to run for political office, which helps. Now, everybody has politics to some degree, so even if you have an independent commission, it's probably not going to be perfect.
Right.
But I think, saying it isn't perfect, so let's stick with the legislatures which are drawing districts that are just like incredibly partisan,
Right.
and not even trying to be fair in how they draw boundaries. It's all about just making more competitive districts. And if you look at Congress, I think in some ways the Senate actually functions a little bit better than the House, and that's partly because you can't gerrymander state lines. And so there are certainly many states that are not competitive. Most states are not competitive, but there are certain states where there are senators who know they could lose a general election more than they could lose a primary, and that does encourage those members to be more moderate. And if we could have more of those created in the House, I think it would just encourage better behavior among the members of Congress. So there are different ways of doing it. I mean, some states, mostly Democratic states, do have various forms of independent commissions right now, but the problem is Democrats don't want to unilaterally disarm and then have like New York be very balanced and then like Florida and Texas be extremely, rigged in the Republican way. So there are problems, but it would just require a vote in Congress. You just have to pass it and the president have to sign. This is not a constitutional amendment. You have to pass it.
Well, that means passing a bill, and I think, what do we have? 5 bills passed so far, then like 100 and I don't know, 150 executive orders. I mean, it's just it's like legislation seems to not be a top priority. Any thoughts, Brendan?
Well, actually, funny thought. I was thinking about a turtle versus Marjorie Taylor Greene. I think I'd rather vote for a turtle, to be honest. But I think AI should be able to do this pretty easily nowadays. I mean, you just create a new, department or agency within the executive branch, hire a bunch of computer scientists. Congress would pass a bill that gives roughly the parameters in terms of how districts should be drawn, like in principle. And then a computer could do that. I mean, we already have this technology. It could do it pretty easily. So that or independent commissions, which I know Canada and maybe other countries do. So I have another idea, though, that eventually I'll get to. But if you change the way we do elections, you would also get rid of gerrymandering because you would remove the importance of redrawing districts. So I'll maybe save that for later. But
all right. Keep the viewers in suspense.
Keep them on the edge of their seat.
On the edge of their seats.
Yes.
All right, Kieran, that's kind of number one. What do you have for number 2?
Another idea is to do with like campaign finance reform. So famous Supreme Court case, Citizens United versus, was it the FEC, I want to say, in 2010, which ruled that campaigns or unions and corporations can spend as much money as they want independently towards a campaign or a candidate.
Right.
They can't coordinate necessarily, so there's still the limit, which I think is $2,700 that a person can donate to to a candidate. But it led to the rise of super PACs, where you can spend as much money as you want, and those, I guess to be fair, aren't as effective as direct donations to a campaign, but they're still, I think, bad for politics. So obviously, people who have more money, corporations, are going to have more influence over politicians. Which I don't think it's so much as like a corporation says, we're gonna give you X amount of money if you vote for our bill. But it is just like the close contact they're going to have, the fact that they're that they know they have this sort of base of support, the people they're talking to are maybe tied to the corporation in some form. So if you could, I think, just limit campaign spending entirely. I know some countries also have limits on like how, like the campaign period, like how long the campaign goes. In the U.S., our campaigns just never end. Yeah, they're permanent almost.
But like the UK, it's like 3 months, I think, or something. It's a really abbreviated.
We're going to have, whatever Democrat wants to challenge Trump is probably going to launch their campaign in January 2027, and the election won't be for almost 2 years.
Yeah.
So, I think that would go a long way. It also makes a big difference, I think, especially for the House members. The House members, where they're up for election every 2 years, they constantly have to raise money because they're, like the Senate, you get a little bit of a break, but the House are constantly up for re-election. And it just leads to constant fundraising. And it eats up, I've heard Republican and Democratic Congress people say, this eats up a ton of our time going around and trying to collect money for re-election campaigns.
There was a show, it was a series on Showtime, The Circus. and I remember they showed like a congressman. I can't remember who it was, but they have like a different building. They have to leave their office in Congress. They can't fundraise, I guess, in their office, but they go to a building that's kind of nearby, and it's just this depressing kind of room with a desk and a phone. And they're like dialing for they got their donor list and they're just hitting people up. And I mean, here you think this is like my career highlight. I'm I'm thinking here's the career highlight. I'm a congressperson representing my district, and then you look at now how sad is it? You're just sitting there, hitting people up for money. It's like oh my gosh, man, that's pretty sad.
Mm-hmm.
But Citizens United, the Supreme Court case, there really hasn't been there's never been a challenge elevated to the Supreme Court since then trying to reverse it. There's always, every campaign always has it and says it's bad, especially the Democrat side.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like there's never been any like official challenge that I can recall mounted against it.
Yeah, I don't know of anything. Maybe there has been stuff at the lower level.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem right now is the makeup of the court would make a challenge not very effective.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a 5-4 ruling, and that was 2010. So at that point in time, the court was not as far right as it is currently.
Yeah.
So if it came before the court right now, it'd probably be a 6-3 ruling, most likely. So I don't. You need to change the makeup of the court, or you would need a constitutional amendment. And limiting spending by corporations, I think would probably, I don't know what the polling is, it's probably very high. I imagine there's a lot of support for that, no matter what your background is. But the threshold for a constitutional amendment is still really high, that getting it through Congress and ratified by the states would be very difficult.
It's talked about whatever 270 or whatever $1 million that Elon Musk spent to help Trump. He did that via a PAC. Did he create his own PAC? Is that how he kind of funneled the money out?
I think so. I'm not positive on that, but I think that's how he did it. I don't know how else he would do it, because he couldn't do that to Trump directly. That would be illegal.
Yeah.
So it must have been through PACs.
Yeah, where he buys one of those NFTs.
And the PACs are not supposed to be in coordination with the campaign, but I don't know. Is there really like zero connection between the PACs and the campaigns? Right. And even if there isn't, there might be somebody in that. Say the PAC is being sponsored by a particular industry. Maybe there's somebody from that industry that's like a lobbyist or a campaign advisor or whatever else for the politicians. I don't know. I think the whole campaign finance system we have in the U.S. is very flawed, and again, wouldn't solve everything, but it's about changing the incentives. If politicians feel like they don't have to worry as much about campaign donations than fundraising, then they might be able to act more freely and act against the interests of lobbyists.
All right. Any thoughts?
Well, I have a question. What would an amendment look like, even in this case? Because, there's nothing really in the Constitution that says you can't restrict this stuff, but it's just a certain interpretation of the First Amendment, because they view money as free speech, which I don't find convincing. But what would an amendment even look like, I guess, is what I'm thinking, because you're almost creating something to add a restriction to the First Amendment.
Yeah, it's tough. I don't know exactly how you'd word it, but I suppose something along the lines of that, Congress shall have the authority to limit donations towards campaigns or something to that effect, political campaigns. There's probably a better way to word it than that.
Might be
along those lines.
The way to limit the money is to shorten the campaign window.
Yeah, that would help.
That's another way.
Less, if you're running a 2-year campaign, that takes so much money, and we kind of got a glimpse of that with the presidential election when Biden bowed out late. It took a couple weeks for everything to coalesce around Harris, and then she basically started a campaign June, thereabouts.
I think it was like July, maybe.
July, yeah. And
July.
So then that's like 4 months. 4 months, and you. So yeah, that was kind of what it would have been like. But now that I just remember, there was an insane amount of money still spent, even with 4 months.
Yeah, they're like record amounts.
Yeah. Oh. Okay. Well, keep firing, Kieran.
Third one I have here is starting to come about, in some places at least, is ranked choice voting.
Yes.
So just about, allowing you to rank who your top candidates are. So you can vote for that third party candidate you really like, but you can put the Democrat or Republican number 2, and then knowing that if your main candidate doesn't get the requisite votes, that your vote will go then to the candidate you feel second best about.
Right.
But ultimately, that's all about trying. I think Alaska and Maine are the states that have done this so far. That's about, again, trying to build a more moderation and coalition building.
Yeah.
If you look at Alaska, that's probably why Lisa Murkowski is still holding the Senate seat there. She's a very moderate Republican, and through ranked choice voting, she's able to. Did she beat Sarah? Is it Sarah Palin or is it somebody else? No, it wasn't Sarah Palin. Might have been somebody else. But it was like a much more conservative Republican backed by Trump in her last election campaign. Whenever
the only
that was.
other one I remember from Alaska was the senator who built the bridge to nowhere. I can't remember his name.
Was that like Sullivan?
He was like there. He was in the Senate for a long time. A really long time.
Oh, was he the World War II guy?
Yeah.
The pilot. His name I can't remember.
I forget. But that's the only thing I remember is the bridge to nowhere was like the ultimate, one of those pork kind of additions. But on a ballot, then you would rank you'd have a list of all the candidates and you'd rank 1, 2, and 3. Is that how you would?
It varies by state. So New York City has its own system of ranked choice voting. Maine and Alaska have their own system. So I think it could take different forms. But I think in Maine, for example, it doesn't kick in unless somebody gets below 50%. I could be wrong about that. Wouldn't quote me on that. I think if you get below 50%, that's when it kicks in. If someone gets a majority, then they just win. But there are different ways of bringing it about, but it would probably allow some third parties to be more competitive, which could be good. You'd also be able to see, I think, more moderate candidates win because they feel like they don't have to appeal to the base as much because they can get votes from other constituencies who might not be their first choice, but they still would rank them higher than somebody else.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think someone like Lisa Murkowski has the ability to be a little bit more anti-Trump, even though she represents a pretty red state, because she does have like a very moderate coalition that backs her, which is possible through ranked choice voting.
Yeah, and Maine is Susan Collins, right? So it's kind of...
She's moderate too, but I think that's a little bit different because the electorate in Maine is just a lot more liberal than Alaska. So I think she almost has to be moderate through political survival. Yeah. Otherwise, Maine just has more Democrats and Republicans, and she wouldn't survive. Yeah. Whereas Alaska is a lot more conservative than Maine.
Yeah. All right. Well, you got the greatest hits. I think you said there were 3, and then it was like a wish list.
Yeah, those are 3 which I think are feasible. None of them would be easy, but they're feasible. And there are other ones which are much more difficult, but I think are just worth thinking about. So one is term limits to the Supreme Court. So that's the Supreme Court has been very politicized recently, and not that it hasn't ever been politicized, but I think it's been more politicized in recent years than it has been in the past. And one of the problems is that as we've gotten more polarized, each Supreme Court seat is now like a life or death thing for each party. Right. When Scalia died, the Republicans would not let Obama fill that seat. Democrats couldn't stop Republicans from filling Ginsburg's seat when she died, but that was obviously hugely upsetting to Democrats and many Americans. And it's just, I think it would be a better political system if people didn't just have to hope that an old person didn't die at the wrong time. That's kind of what it comes down to. And so the probably best way to do that is to have limits where maybe every president gets to appoint, say, 2, something like that, and rotate them out over the course of years. So you have, the number of justices on the court aligned to each party will be based on the election, but it isn't just kind of randomly someone died at the wrong time or something, right? It's more tied. You win the election, you get to appoint 2 members of the Supreme Court. Just that's one possibility, but that'd be very hard to enact because it probably would require a constitutional amendment, and that's just not going to happen.
Yeah. So then, so the math would work if you every 4 years, two justices would roll off, and then the new administration would kind of bring on. They would nominate 2 new candidates.
You'd have to do the math on it. I just threw it too as an example, but maybe you have 12-year terms, and every president appoints 2, and so would that be? How big would the court be then? I don't know, but like maybe you expand the court a little bit or something in the process, make it a little bit larger. But just you could set it. There are ways you could set it up where you would rotate it off, where each president appoints the same number of justices, and then you have a system that feels much fairer than it currently does.
Yeah, because it's just like the problem in the Senate, where it's just become such a kind of geriatric, cohort, that these judges that stay on, in their 70s, 80s. I'm not trying to be ageist. I'm the oldest guy in the room right here, but my goodness, there's a point in time that they've served well. Thank you. Enjoy your time in Boca. Kind of move on.
And it's not just an age thing too. It's if you're someone that you got on the court 20, 30 years ago, your way of thinking is maybe very different than the current electorate, right? So it's a balance. Like, you want to have a Supreme Court that is somewhat in tune with the current norms and values of American society. But of course, it's like you want it to be insulated as well, because you don't want them just doing what voters or politicians want, since that undermines independence. So, but that's why, I always viewed having a 10-year term or something like that would be kind of a nice balance, because 10 years is a long time.
Right.
Have them be non-renewable terms, so you're not worried about winning nomination or anything like that. But it encourages at least a little bit more turnover than we currently have. And I don't think this was as much of a problem, let's say, a century ago, because people just died or retired earlier. But now you've got, the Clarence Thomases and people that have been in the court for quite some time. And I think there are a lot of people that are frustrated with the Supreme Court that doesn't seem to speak to what most Americans maybe want. So.
Well, to your point, if you look at the way they've been, their rulings, it seems like, Thomas and Alito kind of are, they kind of have this their own unique block. But Roberts, Gorsuch, Coney Barrett, they seem to be a little more attuned to that conservative thought that's a little more in tune with today, where Thomas and Alito, that just seems, I think that's just a whole different level of thinking, and you agree?
Yeah. No, I mean, I concur. I mean, and I think something else I wanted to raise in this point was, does our Constitution even have life terms? Because I don't think it does. If you read the text of Article 3, it just says this vague thing on they should maintain their office on good behavior. And then it says something about you can't deduct compensation.
Yeah.
But I'm sure you maybe know the answer to this, but I don't know when that came about, this norm of there's a life term for judges, because I don't see it in Article 3. So maybe all it would take is just someone to be like, hey, that's not in Article 3, so these guys got to step down.
Here's our first hot take of the
another
of the
hot
show.
take from Professor
Another
Connell.
hot take,
Radical.
Yeah, I think it says during good behavior. So I think the late 18th century is understood as being indefinite terms. So if you're looking at an originalist interpretation, I think lifetime terms is probably correct. But I don't know, I guess maybe you could try to reinterpret it or something and say that, oh, no, that just means, it doesn't say you serve forever, just you can't be kicked off as long as if you can't be kicked off as long as you're behaving well, though, then when does it end, right? It doesn't specify.
Yeah.
It doesn't specify an end of the term. So I don't know. I think that'd be very hard to get through the courts. The courts would have to rule on the reinterpretation, which they're probably unlikely to cut themselves short in their seats.
Speaking of the Supreme Court, I saw they were they were hearing the case on a charter school petition from Oklahoma, and Amy Comey Barrett recused herself from it, and which was interesting because I can't remember the last time a justice recused themselves. We've had some lately, some real especially like with Thomas and Alito. There's been some things that were questionable, and they should have recused themselves. But and does it come to either of your minds when the last time a Supreme Court justice bowed out of a ruling?
Didn't Jackson do that in some case involving Harvard that she stepped aside from? And then I think Gorsuch had some case not too long ago where he recused himself too. It doesn't happen all the time, but every once in a while.
At least it was encouraging, to see that. All right, you got the magic list out, so
yeah, I've got other ones too. I mean, we'll get through these eventually, but another one which is just a problem to think about, or maybe it's not a problem. Smaller congressional districts. So when Madison was putting together the first Bill of Rights, the First Amendment to the Constitution, is initially Congress initially approved 12, and the First Amendment under those 12 was actually that that congressional districts would not have more than 30,000 people per representative.
Right.
Once it hit 100 members, you could go up to 40,000, or 100. Once you reached 100 members of the House, you could go up to 40,000. Reach 200 members, you go up to 50,000. But you wouldn't have more than 50,000 members people in the congressional districts. Anything more than that. And the idea was to keep it more representative. You have a smaller district. The person in Congress will be more responsive to the interests, will be closer to the people, have a better idea of what's going on. And that was actually one of the biggest concerns that Anti-Federalists had in ratifying the Constitution, is they didn't feel like, they felt like the districts are going to be too big and the politicians would just be out of touch with the voters.
Right.
This was not ratified by the states, so that's why it's not the First Amendment. But it's still interesting to think about. I don't know, maybe it's not a problem, but today the average congressional district has, I think it's somewhere around 700,000 people.
I thought it was 750.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Which like my daughter lives in Vermont, and they have one congressperson, because that's basically Vermont.
Yeah, Vermont's like 630, I think. Yeah. So yeah, it's the problem is partly logistics. Yeah. Like, how do you, if you kept it at 50,000 per congressional district, I can't do the math on it, but you have thousands of members of the House, and that just wouldn't be workable.
Right.
Which is probably why it wasn't ratified in the first place. It wouldn't, the expanding size of the government, the House, would just be unwieldy over time. But I think it does raise an interesting question. Is this a problem? Like, would members of Congress be more responsive if they had smaller districts? I don't know the answer to that.
Right.
I've seen people come down on both sides of the fence on this issue. But if you have a smaller district, maybe you need you spend less time campaigning, so it doesn't cost so much to campaign in a small district, given the number of people in the district. And maybe you do have closer ties to the people if your district is smaller. I don't know, but it's just something I've always thought was interesting and was not really a good solution to the problem, if there is a problem.
Could it potentially make things less partisan? You start, like, just say instead of 750, you cut in half, and in your district's 325, each, that there's a potential for maybe, one from each party. Some states, Arkansas, it won't happen, but
maybe it would allow more ideological diversity, maybe.
There you go.
It would weaken the Senate bias in the Electoral College, which would be one plus, because then you would have the House weighing heavier on the Electoral College rather than the Senate, which would make it more proportional, theoretically at least. So it's just an idea. I've always thought it was interesting. I don't know. It's not going to happen. You can't expand the House to have 8,000 members or whatever. Like the cost would be crazy. You wouldn't have space for it. It would cause so many problems. But the U.S., if you compare it to other democracies, does have is much less representative in this sense. That it has other democracies tend to have smaller districts relative to the politician.
Well, space. I know Doge is opening up a lot of office space.
Yeah, there's that.
Have plenty of space to fill.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Anything else on that list?
I have two more. So one would be to try to take some power away from the executive. We've talked about in the past how the executive has gotten very powerful over time. And actually, when Madison was writing the initial amendments, he initially had 17 amendments, 12 of which were approved by Congress, 10 of which were ratified by the states. His initial 16th amendment was that that the branches were not allowed to delegate power that they had to another branch. It had to be practiced by that branch specifically. That did not make it, obviously, through Congress or to the states. But that, I think, brings up interesting questions about like war-making powers, for example. So we've basically handed that over to the president in a way that I think is probably not constitutional, but is just widely accepted. There's also the tariff issue. I mean, the Constitution is very clear that tariff power of commerce, which includes tariffs, is with the legislature, not with the president. But they basically gave that power to the presidency. So if you have something like some kind of amendment along those lines, then maybe you could take some of that power away from the president and give it back to Congress.
Which, the tariffs, Trump just found a backdoor solution by finding it, calling it an emergency and drawing upon an old, act that authorizes the president to act in terms of emergency, and then he went and did that, and it just, you have complacency then with Congress. Because they could stop it, right? And just say, sorry, sir. This, and I think I just read that a justice ruled that the Alien Enemies Act can't be used as justification for deportation. Did either of you guys see that?
I didn't see that, but that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
I think he's using it in a way that's just not related to the letter of the law as it was in 1798.
Yeah, which is same with, what's the act that he justified being able to impose tariffs from the executive branch. It was another act that he...
Something from the 70s, was it? The trade... It might have been like the Trade Expansion Act or something.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of those acts.
But it was something that's used on, in emergency, but...
So I had a comment on that, because is the reason we have a more powerful presidency right now because of delegation, or is it something else that it's just you have a president that over time, gradually expands how things are maybe interpreted in the Constitution? So like war is a great example here, because war, it's a little bit unclear, like commander in chief versus power to declare war. So there's this like gray area that I think presidents have been able to exploit over time, and the public's usually willing to support it, where presidents can kind of use force without any role for Congress. Congress tried to rein this in during the Nixon administration with the War Powers Resolution Act, and that's still on the books. But that's done basically nothing. I mean, there are some people that maybe think that's important, but the War Powers Resolution has essentially just been ignored because I would say because voters are willing to get behind a president, at least temporarily, to support, sending the troops abroad.
Well, I think just present day, the pushback from Congress is difficult because the majority party, the Republicans in the House, just have a kind of a pretty fragile coalition, right? They just, it's not like that everybody can be counted on to vote uniformly on a particular act. They just feel there's always going to be some group of people splintering off, and then it takes away their effectiveness.
I think part of it's that there's an advantage to being one person versus 435 or 100 in the Senate. But I think it's more just you just don't want to be someone that goes against a president that's trying to do something for the nation and for national security, right? Maybe it'd be different today, but like I just know, like I grew up during like the post 9/11 era, and like all those wars were politically popular when they started, and if you were a member of Congress that wanted to get in the way, there were a few of them. they didn't look good.
Right.
Like they were treated as un-Americans.
Yeah.
So today, though, I'd imagine because how things are just so much more polarized, there'd probably be more pushback, but it wouldn't come from the incumbent's party. It would come from the opposition party. And again, is that enough to stop a powerful president that's willing to expand his or her powers? Probably not.
Yeah, which, got me to kind of one of my, from my wish list was just, can we please have 3 branches of government again, please? It's, Congress, they've stopped passing legislation. The only thing I ever hear is every once in a while they're talking about this big, beautiful budget bill they're putting together, and then they just go back and in the shadows somewhere, and there's just nothing. Even like yesterday, they put it up for a vote about trying to pull back Trump's ability to implement tariffs, and they couldn't get that passed. It's just it's kind of they've I guess they're comfortable being neutered, and that's and then what you get in places, you have an executive and Trump who's very comfortable moving into that vacuum and seizing as much power as he can, and so that's what we're getting now. Where are the courts? It's you got basically attacking and dismantling the federal government. Just take a wrecking ball to the federal government. So the government's the enemy, as Reagan said. Well, Musk and Trump have helped basically make it ineffective by just taking away all the personnel and then all the money, and not a word. You can attack law firms, you can attack universities, you can do deportation without due process, and oopsie, administrative error, but still that poor guy is rotting in a El Salvadoran prison, and where the courts operate slowly, and when you have somebody that's operating at what was that Steve Bannon term, like maximum velocity or some he had some term that it's gonna that's where the House and the Senate, they have to somehow bring this in balance, but we're just a nation right now operating in an imbalance in my mind. It was beautifully crafted how the 3 branches were there, all checks, and the whole thing, checks and balances. It doesn't exist now.
Or I would say they're still there, but they're just being ignored.
Yeah.
And it's like the deeper philosophical question of like, why does a constitution matter? Why do checks and balances matter? Because they really are just words that are written down on a piece of paper. So it takes like almost like a critical mass to realize the importance of checks and balances and put that in front of your self-interest, partisan interest, whatever interest. But it would appear that there are less people in the electorate and less people in government that are willing to abide by checks and balances so long as it benefits them, however defined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thoughts, Kieran?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real problem. I think, and part of the issue is that government doesn't always work very well and doesn't work very well. People get disillusioned with it, and I think the value of checks and balances, people don't recognize the importance of that. If they feel like the government's just not working anyway, why do we need to follow these rules? It's just ineffective from the beginning. But yeah, checks and balances ultimately are just words on a piece of paper. If you're not willing to enforce them, if the people aren't willing to enforce them, you need to be able, they're not really going to do a whole lot. And that, if you go back to the founding generation, there's a lot of a widespread belief that for a republic to work, you need to have a virtuous citizenry. Without the virtue of the people, the republic won't survive. And, part of the virtue of the people is making sure that they think those words on paper are more than just words on paper. They actually mean something, and to back them up. And we don't have a very engaged citizenry if you compare us to other democracies. Our voter turnout rate is pretty low. We are very polarized. Lots of people don't vote. People aren't always very well informed, which is part of the issue too. Politics is complicated, and I think a lot of people just kind of tune out to it. I think if you poll the average American just on basic political issues, it would be surprising about how incredibly not informed they are, especially considering, the just being on a college campus. We probably don't interact with those kinds of people all that often, but that is much of the population, and you can't mobilize enough people to see the value and the support, and to support the system of government we have. It's hard for it to function effectively.
Yeah. Well, Brandon, how about you? What's
okay. To be fair, a lot of the things I thought up before coming here, Kieran just mentioned. But let me give at least one thing that wasn't mentioned yet. So I would want to see a change to at the very least, the House elections by instituting proportional representation voting rules, or PR voting rules. So I'll describe for our viewers, the way things that are done now is it's single member districts, right? And this relates to gerrymandering, because you got to draw all these different districts within most states.
Right.
And each district has one winner.
Right.
And that winner is whoever gets a plurality of the votes. So there's no bonus points for coming in second. There's no bonus points for coming in third, fourth, fifth. And what that does is, the tendency is, when you have voting rules like that, it creates a two-party system, which coincidentally we have a two-party system. There are plenty of smaller third parties, but none of them have a real chance usually of winning in any particular district. So there's a lot of benefits I think could happen by switching to PR voting rules. The way PR would work is, there's different ways of doing it, but let's just say Arkansas, we have, 4 congressional districts? Forget about districts. You don't need to redraw districts. So we just got rid of the problem of gerrymandering. Have everyone in Arkansas vote, but not for a candidate, you vote for a party. I'll come back to that. I think that's a benefit to voting for parties rather than candidates. But let's just say then, so Republicans won, 70% of the votes, something like that, and then 30% goes to Democrats. Then you'd give 70% of Arkansas seats to Republicans, give or take, and then 30% to Democrats. Or maybe it'd be 3 seats to Republicans, 1 to Democrats. So now, by doing it that way, the first thing that's happening is you're giving more of a voice to the minority in Arkansas, or the minority in any state. So, voting for the losing party, you're still getting a couple of seats. Related to that would allow third parties to flourish, because now you don't need to win an election. You just need to win a little bit of the vote, and then you get some representation in Congress. So then you get a bunch of third parties, and I think that could be good, because then Republican and Democratic policymakers gotta keep themselves in check, right? They're fighting now against third parties, and you do allow, I think, just a more diverse range of views, right? You're not just stuck with choosing between 2 parties. And you hear a lot of Americans complain about that. I'll go back to it's an awkward idea for Americans to vote for a party. We're so used to voting for candidates, but it's more of a European way of doing things. Is you actually go and vote for a party, and that would be good, because it would make people care and vote more on the basis of policy issues rather than personalities, which I would argue is the reason we're in the time we're in right now, is voting for charisma and personalities rather than substance.
Right.
So that's yet another benefit. Last thing I think I'll say is, if you've got all these different parties now in Congress, or at least in the House, where one party maybe doesn't have a majority, right? And so now you are forcing parties to build coalitions, which means you're forcing compromises and moderation. So we're back to that, trying to get rid of polarization and encourage some sort of coalition building, which is a lot of how Europe does it. So there's like a ton of benefits that could come from changing to a PR system. And I think it's possible to do that for the House, at least, without an amendment.
Right.
So it's somewhat you could do this, but very unlikely to happen because both parties would lose. So why would you reintroduce this stuff? And for that same reason, if you look around the world, it doesn't happen that often where a country will switch from PR to majoritarian voting rules or vice versa. Like I think New Zealand is the only country that's done this off the top of my head. I think in like the 90s or something. I don't know why they did it.
Yeah.
Maybe we should study New Zealand and we'll learn a lesson. But that's something I think is like somewhat I could see a world where maybe that happens just because it doesn't include an amendment.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the first thing I had on my list. I also had putting some sort of restrictions on campaign finance and trying to take money out of politics. We've already talked about this, so I'm not going to say too much more on it, but I kind of find this argument ludicrous about money being free speech.
Yes.
Even if you want to treat money as speech, it's like nothing in our Constitution, none of those civil liberties are absolute. The question becomes, do you get enough benefit out of restricting someone's First Amendment rights or whatever amendment rights, right? Even with something like free speech, you can't yell fire in a movie theater, right? And the benefit of restricting that speech is, safety, like public safety. So you got to ask yourself, is like restricting money in politics, is that compensated by another gain you're making, which is really getting rid of corruption and just all this like, special interest politics that'll push back against policies that help voters. So I don't know, maybe eventually there'll be some other case that'll make their way to the Supreme Court and they'll overrule Citizens United. I don't think it'll happen with the current composition of our court, but maybe in the future.
Well, you have AOC and Bernie, trying to get out to fight the oligarchy and everything. I had an article here about that you got like 8 billionaire families that their campaign donations total like $900 million. It's that's basically what we're going to, is that it's that autocrat that has the money and has the influence. And so then, they start, that's how things start to shape. Bezos, just look at, he dials back the editorial content from the Washington Post. They would have, endorsed the Democrat candidate. They didn't. Melania Trump gets a $40 million documentary from there, and it's just, it's just, he's not doing that because he's had a sudden shift in political views. That's all a way to buy, that he buys influence, and Musk is obviously self-serving, and you go right on down the list, and this is what Citizens United kind of spawned, was just this, where it just opened up the floodgates. And now when you have this cadre of super rich, then that, and they have the money to really put some real influence in their favor.
Yeah. And it's almost common sense, right? It's like it undermines the democratic process.
Yeah.
And we know this. We know you need campaign contributions to win any congressional election. Who gives most of the campaign contributions? Right. Naturally, it's the most wealthy. So it's like, why not restrict that?
Yeah.
Self-interest, though.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else from you, sir?
I also had Supreme Court justices getting term limits. So we've already taled about that. I'll bring up another radical idea, though.
Second hot take, okay?
I have some. I don't think this would work, but I have some students that they'll sometimes say this in class. What if you made quotas on the Supreme Court where, like, maybe like shake up the numbers, but like have roughly half of the justices need to be nominated by the Democrats and then half of the justices by the Republicans. Like the argument is that undermines the political independence of the court because you're acknowledging now that these justices are partisan.
Right.
But I say, forget about that. Like
Right.
they're already
yeah.
biased, right? So let's stop ignoring, what the reality is.
Right.
And let's just admit that
Yeah.
no justice is perfectly neutral. And let's just try to find a way to make the court maintain balance roughly.
Right.
I don't know. What do we think about that idea?
I think you'd have to word it something like the largest party in Congress has, X number of seats, and the second largest party in Congress has X number of seats. If you word it, you're putting like Republicans and Democrats into the political system,
it could
then
switch at any time.
Yeah, then you're basically taking these two parties and making them permanent in a way. So you'd have to, I don't know, there's probably a good way to word it. We get around saying Democrat or Republican.
Yeah.
But in theory, I think something like that would make sense. It'd be incredibly hard to do. But yeah, they're all partisan to some degree. Nobody's getting nominated to the court with the expectation they're going to be just totally unbiased, umpires that they're supposed to be.
Right.
So they all bring in their own biases and their backgrounds. Trump is not picking. He didn't pick his nominees at random. They're from the Federalist Society. Biden, I'm sure when he was trying to find the justice or potential justice to nominate, he was had certain qualifications he was looking for in terms of ideology and ruling history.
Didn't they have to be a female? He had like some specific mention as far as that this was going to be who the candidate was.
Yeah, he wanted. I think he was a black woman, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, Trump actually did the same thing. People don't talk about that as much, but when Ginsburg died, Trump came out and said, "I'm going to nominate a woman to fill Ginsburg's seat," and he did with Amy Coney Barrett. This is kind of connected to it a little bit, though it's maybe slightly off topic. But one benefit the Supreme Court has is that it does work in secret. You can't bring cameras into the Supreme Court, which I think might actually help sometimes. And I wonder, with this politics of personality and this we have C-SPAN in Congress and everything being posted on social media from Congress. Sometimes governing is hard. You have to make difficult decisions. You have to compromise. You have to make unpopular decisions. And I think the incredible transparency we have in Congress sometimes makes that very difficult. And also encourages, I used the term grandstanding earlier, encourages grandstanding where I think certain members of Congress are just they're behaving for the cameras. And if you got rid of all those cameras and made it more like the Supreme Court, would that help? It's not going to fix. It's certainly not a silver bullet or anything, but would that make any difference?
Let's bring back the smoke-filled rooms, like the good old days. I know what you mean. That is there a way to just, Marjorie Taylor Greene wears the "Make America Great" red hat, or now everybody, I'm probably wrong, but where it started with Obama when the guy jumped up and said, "You lie," and
I remember that.
And now it just seems like that's just, that people, that decorum goes away, and it's all performative. The guy who's shaking his cane at Trump, and then but Republicans have had their moments as well. It's just maybe bring a little less transparency.
It's social media too. If you go back to 2005, I mean, what were you gonna do? Be on C-SPAN, being obnoxious? Nobody watches C-SPAN. So when you're talking about now you have clips of Congress that are on Facebook or Twitter or TikTok, whatever. It's just it's everywhere. And I don't know, if you go back to the Constitutional Convention was secret, and part of that was they had to make some decisions that were pretty unpopular. Not everybody's gonna but sometimes secrecy, you don't want total secrecy, but too much transparency in government can also be too bad. We can also be bad and harmful. Just kind of the point I'm making.
All right.
I have one more idea that just came to mind too that I always say is
it's not possibly a third hot take. I don't know. That might be a press.
This is a little bit of a hot take, but not really. I would get rid of primaries. I'm kind of done with primaries.
Yeah.
This relates to not visibility, but again, just kind of going back to smoke-filled rooms and keeping things slightly more insulated. If you allow political parties and the establishment to kind of select candidates for voters, you arguably take out the role of personalities a little bit, and it's still democratic. You're still voting in a general election, but you allow parties and you trust parties to filter out candidates that are potentially dangerous to democracy. So I don't think we get Trump in 2016 if we don't have primaries.
Oh, yeah.
The Republican Party would have blocked him out, and then all of a sudden, though, Trump wins that election, and then the whole landscape changes.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I think that's one idea. That it's not my own idea. There are other political scientists that have offered this idea, and I tend to agree with it nowadays. Which is, I think you could have too much democracy.
Yeah.
I think that could be worse at times than not enough democracy.
Oh, look at California, where they put all these propositions up for vote. That's democracy, and they've some horrible outcomes have come from that.
Oh yeah.
And that's smart.
And the primary system is pretty new. I don't think people really realize that, is that the modern primary system is probably came in development, I would say, in the 70s.
Yeah.
It's not that there weren't ever primaries before that, but what would happen is you'd have a few elections, and then one candidate would go into the convention with a few delegates from the states that he won. No she in this area. He won.
Right.
And that would give that person an advantage at the convention, but they wouldn't have won the nomination. So you go to New Hampshire. New Hampshire's always been an important state. You win New Hampshire, that helps you at the convention because you have delegates going in, but the convention could still go for somebody else. And that is like a problem. Like a lot of our solutions that we talked about so far have been about trying to encourage more coalition building and more moderation in a lot of ways. And primaries are a problem because you have people who are very, very engaged turnout, who tend to be very strong partisans. Usually, you don't have a bunch of moderates turnout in primaries. And in some states, you can't vote in the primary if you're not registered in political parties. So if you're unaffiliated, you can't vote. So that's Arkansas. Actually, you can vote in whatever party you want in the primary, very open here. But a lot of states aren't like that. Like New York wasn't like that. New York, when I grew up in New York, I had to register in a political party, otherwise I couldn't vote in the primary. And that pushes people out of the process as well, who might be a little bit more centrist and moderate. And you encourage the extremes again. Yeah. And I think in politics, I'm not the other person who believes that moderation is always good, because it's not. Some moderate positions can be really bad. But in general, you don't want to empower the extremes too much most of the time, because it tends to lead to politics that are not in line with what people want, politicians who are not aligned with what the people at large believe, and it gives disproportionate power to a very small group of people who are very engaged and whose views are just not representative of the population at large.
Yeah. All right. I have two things. Start with just a basic one. That can somehow everyone just recognize that there are truths, that there are things that are true. Like, take for example climate change. That seems to be just, well, it's a matter of opinion, and that and so depending on your political persuasion, you either see everything that's happening, as just, well, that it's just a cycle, and that everything's fine, but or that legions of scientists, will present a case that yes, the Earth is warming, and that here's the consequences of it, and it just seems that we can't arrive at a truth. You have January 6th that was more or less an insurrection. That no, it was really just a protest that a couple people got out of hand. It's just you can't arrive at that a truth. You have a president that I have no power to bring this man out of the El Salvadoran prison. Then it turns out that of course he does. And it's just something that it's just truth is what you want, what either party or anyone for that matter, what they want to make it, and it's almost that we're at that Orwellian state that it just becomes rather scary to me.
I think a lot of that would be you'd have to change human nature. And some of that is just humans are humans. There are probably ways you can make people accept the truth more effectively, maybe through some changes. So like with climate change, because you brought that up, a big part of the problem with that is that the fossil fuel industry has poured a ton of money into doubting the science on that.
Sure.
And it's made millions of Americans really question whether or not the climate is warming, and even if it is, whether or not humans are actually causing it or playing any sort of role in it. So that's one place where maybe you could take an actual policy change, limit the donations of corporations, and then maybe then you have politicians who are more willing to take a stand on that issue. So a lot of those problems are real problems, but I think you in many cases would have to change human nature, which is probably even harder than changing the Constitution in some ways.
Yeah, that's why I just kind of threw it up, because the other one was, can America be part of the world again? We're very quickly becoming isolated from the world, based on policy that antagonizes and just the America first, just kind of there's positives to it, that you want to, because of course every country will think of themselves first, but it tends to be just us only, and we are quickly just unraveling kind of a world order, and that isn't a good thing. Just not now it's going to be this transactional relationship with 190 different countries as trading partners, and if Ukraine is fighting for its sovereignty, we might help you, but you got to give us a rare minerals deal. It's and the list keeps going on, and I don't know about you guys, but that's just not the America that I believe we could be. I don't want to be like Pollyannish and that we are a force for good in the world, and and all, because there's a lot of hypocrisy, because of course we've done things wrong, but there's a lot of things that we have done incredibly right, and it's kind of like we're in full scale retreat, and just it's just all we care about is us. All we care about is getting the best deal. All we care about is that we're going to do, we're going to win, and they're going to lose. I don't know. That's just not the America I wish we were.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is just normatively, it's probably the right thing to do is to take a leadership role and be on the right side of things like human rights and climate change and all these things. But you could even say, just thinking from it from like a pure self-interest perspective, the U.S. is still a dominant power, but it's not the only dominant power anymore. It's a much more multipolar world than it was 2 or 3 decades ago. So I would say that, what probably the current administration doesn't fully comprehend is our ability to further U.S. interests is not just up to us. We're going to need allies in the future. So you can't just be quick to burn these bridges for short-term gains when you're kind of sacrificing potential long-term gains. So yeah, I completely agree. And I say this as someone who I've actually been very critical of kind of some of the political aspects of globalization. I've said things that are somewhat critical of NATO and what other organizations do I hate on? The IMF. I mean, global governance is not without its problems.
NAFTA and whatever Trump replaced it with, all the
USMCA. Yeah, I mean, it's not without its problems, but that doesn't necessarily mean the solution now is just to rip it all up.
Yeah.
And it is one of those things where I think everyone, probably including myself, takes these institutions for granted because it's the only thing we've ever known. I've only lived in a NATO world. I've only lived in a world where there's the UN. Most of this stuff is post-World War II that has been, maybe not primarily responsible, but somewhat responsible for the world being not as violent as it was before, World War II, World War I, right? We haven't had World War III. So I agree. I don't think we should just kind of rip up multilateralism, rip up all these IGOs, all these treaties, and then just go it alone, because it's probably not gonna end well, and it's not gonna be, again, the most effective way to further our interests, right? No one's saying America second. No one's ever said that, right? But the spirit of America first does seem to be isolationism and doing things unilaterally.
Yeah, I think most people don't understand how much more peaceful the world is today than it was at any point in human history. Like we're coming up actually on the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. Hitler killed himself 80 years ago yesterday. So we're right at the end of World War II, 80 years ago.
We almost went the whole show without a historic hot take, and now we have one.
Almost. But yeah, the German surrender will be in a few days, 80 years ago in a few days. But, the world post-World War II has, obviously there's been war, but I think if you were to ask people, like, if you just were to poll people, do you think the world is more violent today than it used to be? I think most people would say yes. Yeah. And it's like completely wrong. Like, they couldn't be more wrong about it. I remember watching the 75th anniversary of D-Day, which was 6 years ago. Vice News had gone and interviewed this German soldier who had fought at D-Day, and he had said something to the effect of the interview, because of this war, now we have a much more peaceful world. And there are people just like ripping him in the comments, like, what do you mean peaceful, old man? Yeah. What are you talking about? The world's so much violence today. But he was right. Like, the world today is much more peaceful. And to some degree, all these international organizations and the ties we have around the world, I think incentivize us not to go to war. And nuclear weapons play a role in that too, because a major war today would be just catastrophically destructive. So yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. The world is just much more peaceful than it's ever been in the past. I had a second point too, but I lost my train of thought as I was going through my first point. So I'll just stop with my first point. The one thing we didn't discuss yet, which isn't about that, but maybe worth for like probably over on time, but just like 1 minute, is the Electoral College. Because I think if you were actually to ask Americans, what do you want to reform? I think the Electoral College would come up.
Amen.
Yeah.
And so how would we reform it?
Well, it's hard because you'd have to.
It's by state, right? You have to go state by state.
Well, you could just amend the Constitution and get rid of it. Yeah. But what I think is interesting is that like the way we use the Electoral College is basically winner take all, where if you win a state by one vote, you get all the delegates and or all the electors. And the only exceptions are Maine and Nebraska, which they do it by congressional district, but that's such a small part of the overall electoral map that doesn't really make much of a difference. But there's nothing in the Constitution that says you couldn't make it proportional, and you could get around a constitutional amendment if the states just agreed to say we're going to allocate our electoral votes proportionally. So if you have a state with 10 electoral votes, or say I think Wisconsin does, for example, and say the Democrat wins 60% of the vote in Wisconsin, they get 6 out of the 10 electors. And that would keep the system in place. You wouldn't need an amendment, but you need every state to do that, which is maybe even harder than an amendment. So probably another pipe dream.
Yeah. No,
could you do that with legislation, federal legislation, and you're not getting rid of the Electoral College? You just change?
That's a good question. Maybe you could. I'm not sure. I wouldn't be shocked if like an originalist interpretation would be that you can't do that. The states have to be in charge of that. I'm not sure how it's worded exactly. I'd have to look into that. But that would make it much more efficient. A much more efficient way of doing that. So you have to do it proportionally. Because sometimes the argument against the in favor of the Electoral College is like, oh, you need to give smaller states more power. If you put it up into a popular vote, then people are just going to campaign in the big cities. If you just make it proportional, you're still giving like Vermont disproportionate power because of the Senate seats that they get that come through the Electoral College, but then you're making it more representative. And that would be, I think, it's still a very hard solution, but it'd be an easier solution than amending the Constitution. And even if we brought about a popular vote, there are potential problems with that, in that, like, if you have 5 candidates and the candidate that gets the most votes gets 31% of the vote and they become president, is that better than the Electoral College? Then you'd have to develop a runoff system. There are a lot of questions that come into the system if you're going to make it a popular vote too.
You could do ranked choice though for that.
You could do ranked choice at a national level, that might require a constitutional amendment. There's a lot of obstacles.
Yeah.
Well, the good thing is that we all of us know that we have a lot of influential people in Washington, D.C. that tune in to this podcast, and I think we've given them a lot of great recommendations. I'm surprised neither of you brought up daylight savings time.
Oh, there is that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a major one. But nevertheless, one last thing before we wrap up. Last show we did our who's going to go first, in the Trump administration. And Brendan, who does it appear that's going to be first out the door now?
Oh, so we're gonna make another prediction?
No.
Oh.
But who's
Waltz? You're saying? Who got shit?
Yeah.
Although, did he technically? Well, he got fired, I guess, but he got shifted around. So I think it's still a live ball. It's yeah.
What you agree?
That Waltz was the first one out?
No, that the predictions still are valid. We can't. We didn't say fired. This is a shifting. So.
Well, what position does he have technically? He's the
National Security Advisor.
So he's not a cabinet official then, right? So we say cabinet. Man. We said cabinet.
Yes,
I think.
Oh, we did say cabinet.
All
okay,
right.
all right. But then maybe he's right, because Rubio now is out of Secretary of State and he's going to be NSA.
Rubio's out.
I think they moved him to National Security Advisor.
Oh, they did. I didn't see that.
I think it literally happened a couple minutes. I think before the podcast started. I just looked at my phone. But the other guy got kicked to UN ambassador.
Oh well, yeah.
So
if Rubio's
significantly weaker position,
have to read on that. But if that's the case, then I would be right. I think I would
take
claim
look
for
at
that. Because that's probably National Security Advisor is probably a little bit less influential than Secretary of State, I would say. That's kind of a demotion for Rubio, if that's the case, which to me would indicate that maybe he's losing influence in the administration, that he's because he's not, I said this a few weeks ago, he's not like a true MAGA believer in the way that I think the other guys are, many of the other guys are.
Yeah.
So it seemed like ideologically it just wouldn't be enough consistency for him to stay in the administration all 4 years.
Well done. So, this was a marathon session.
geez, fun.
Well, yeah, but
it was fun though.
No, this was excellent. It's a great way to wrap up. I hope you guys have a great summer. We'll come back all fired up with ideas in August. And just to wrap up, thank you everyone who's listened and watched our podcast. We hope that that you recommend us to others. We also hope, and this is dramatic pause, producer Cheyenne's ready for this, that if you watch our podcast, that you give us a review. And if you do, how many stars should you give us?
5 out of 5.
Yeah, she's always been right, yes. But again, Kieran, Brendan, man, it's been so great hanging out with you, just talking stuff. It's a great way to geek out, and I think the ideas you guys had were fantastic. So all you people in Washington, just please follow follow our lead. And again, thank you for watching As the World Turns or Burns, and we will catch up with you again in August. Take care.
This podcast is sponsored in part by Lyon College and Kilt Studios. Thank you to Jonah Winter for the intro and outro music.